Let me tell you a story to introduce what we're going to think about for this last session. I mentioned, I think, the other day that I grew up in a Christian family. I grew up in Leicester. Leicester's famous for two things back in England. It's famous for having a very good football team for one season. A few years ago, you might remember Leicester City winning the Premier League. We became world famous for one season. The second thing that Leicester is kind of internally famous for is that Leicester is the most ethnically diverse city in Britain. It was the first city in Britain to have an ethnic majority, which means more people from a non-British background than a British background. So in the school that I grew up in, we had all sorts of ethnic backgrounds represented, and of course, because of that, different religious backgrounds represented. We had atheists, we had Jews, we had Muslims, we had Sikhs, we had Buddhists. You name it, you could find it in my school and in our city. I grew up in a Christian family, and obviously when you grow up in a Christian family, you kind of assume that Christianity is true because everyone you know that you trust in life believes the same thing. But of course, when you become a teenager and you go to high school, you suddenly discover other people don't believe the same thing as you. And that was quite a pivotal moment in my own Christian walk. And so growing up, going to that school, I discovered that there were only 3 people, myself included, in that school who would have been publicly willing to declare themselves Christian. There may have been other Christians, but only 3 people who would have called themselves that publicly. In a school of 1,000 boys, it was an all-boys school. And so we got together and we formed what we called the Christian Union. The only problem was it was a little bit boring because there was only 3 of us in it. So I was the president, my friend was the vice president, the other guy was the secretary. And we used to meet each week and just do this Bible study in this class over lunch. And then we thought, well, wouldn't it be more fun if we invited people who were not Christians to come along, because then at least there'd be more people and it might be more interesting. So then we decided to have, we'd heard of the idea from somewhere else, an event called Grill a Christian. In other words, you invite people to come and ask any question they like of a Christian, no holds barred, no kind of filtering of the questions, they can just ask what they like. And in a kind of teenage environment full of boys, at that particular time, this was quite an attractive proposition for a lot of people. We put up provocative posters all over the school. We put messages in all the registers. We gave notices in the assemblies. And I was kind of thinking, well, is anyone going to come? We got to the first time we did it. I remember going into the classroom and opening the door, and there was about 70 boys all in there. There were no teachers anywhere in sight. So it was kind of crazy because you had people throwing bananas across the room. We had people smoking stuff out of the back window. It was just mayhem. And I, of course, wasn't going to answer the questions myself. I was no idea how I was going to answer questions. So what I did is I invited one of my friends, my youth leader from church, one of the elders of the local church, to come and answer the questions. And so he came along, and I have to say, when I introduced him to the class or to the room, I thought to myself, this is probably a really bad idea, because there's no way that he's going to be able to answer all of their angry and antagonistic questions. And I'm basically just going to look like a complete idiot. And I'm the one that's going to have to get beaten up for this for the next few months. It's all right for him. He's going to be able to leave. And something incredible happened. I sat there for an hour. I handed over to my friend, and he started answering questions. And I sat there for an hour, and I just watched him simply, clearly, succinctly, warmly, sometimes humorously, answer people's questions. And as far as I know, no one became a Christian as a result of that event. But something really significant happened in my life, and that was, for the first time, I really realized that Christianity stood up to objective public questioning, even hostile public questioning. And I also realized that the Christian faith was publicly true, that even if I hadn't been brought up in a Christian family, and that my background had been completely different, I should still be a Christian because it is true. It still stands up to that kind of interrogation. And so it was very significant for me, even if it wasn't necessarily immediately fruitful for the people who were there. But that was a really crucial time in my own Christian walk, because it was a moment where I realized I didn't need to be fearful of my faith as a Christian, and I didn't need to be fearful of questions. And that was my first experience, really, of seeing a Christian in a public environment in front of non-Christians answer questions. Now, I say it is significant because actually now, in my ministry, this is what I do a lot of the time. Not always in a kind of guerrilla Christian event in a high school, although sometimes I still do them, and they're normally quite fun because, you know, go into a load of 14-year-old boys and you'll get very honest questions. But also, in any talk that I give in an evangelistic context, I also give people the opportunity to ask questions at the end. So Q&A is something that I love doing. Some people find that kind of strange because most of my friends, when they start learning in terms of evangelistic preaching, say, I don't mind doing the talk, it's the Q&A that scares me. And I can understand that and appreciate that, and we'll think about that in a minute. But I have to say, actually, this is the part of evangelism that I really, really enjoy. And I much rather speak to a bunch of atheists or complete non-Christians or a room full of Muslims than I would speak to a room full of Christians. So I'm more scared speaking to you guys today. Different contexts in which this could happen. Well, obviously, as I said, you might do a particular kind of question time event. Like we might call it Guerrilla Christian question time. Could be in a high school, could be in a university, could be in the pub. It's quite good in a dynamic where it wouldn't be possible just to give a talk because there's more group participation. So the kind of event that you do in a cafe or a pub where there's a bit of kind of background noise, people aren't necessarily there for the event, you can grab people in and have a question time, get people engaged, that kind of thing. But sometimes, as I said, I'll do this after a set-piece evangelistic talk. So the value of that is the talk sometimes generates interest and creates questions, and then the opportunity at the end is for people to raise the questions that the talk has brought about. And increasingly, I find that's helpful because sometimes people don't yet have questions. In an increasingly secular society where people have heard nothing about the Christian faith, it's not like they're coming with a whole list of questions that they want to ask. And so they need to actually hear something about the Christian claim before they have any questions to ask. We're in a different society, a different culture than we were when I was at high school, aged 14. And there's different ways you can do it. You could have, in that situation, just one Christian standing up answering questions. Or what you can do is have a panel answering questions. That's a particularly good way to mentor and train younger Christians. Because if you're put up on your own to answer questions, there's a great sense of responsibility of, I've got to be able to answer any question. And that's quite a fearful thing to do. But if you have a panel of Christians, maybe one older, more mature Christian, along with 3 younger Christians, then what you can do is take the pressure off. Because even if they can't answer the question, you've got someone who can. The other beauty of that is you can prime people to be ready for certain types of questions in that environment. So, my friend Andy Wickham, who was the guy from Spain who you saw in the video a couple of days ago when Lindsay was here, he does this as part of his Proclama network. So he gets 4 students and he trains them before and he says, okay, you guys are going to have questions on suffering and sexuality, and you're going to have questions about other religions and hell, and you're going to have questions about science, and you're going to have questions about the Bible, and so on. So they know what their kind of area of questioning is going to be. And then he goes beforehand and gives them training so they're prepared in that particular area to answer any questions. And then in the public Q&A, when questions come up, he knows what kind of question it is, and he knows who he can give that question to. So it's a great way of training people without them having to know everything about everything in the first place. So those are some different contexts in that you can do it. Some of them can be quite lively. I find in high school situations, they're much more lively than student settings, just because of the nature of high school students versus university students. So a little bit less polite, kind of more fun sometimes, I have to say. Now, why is it important to do it? Here are some reasons why I think it's really valuable. Firstly, it shows that the gospel is publicly true. That was the conviction that I discovered as I watched this happen as a 14-year-old. And the amazing thing that I discover is it's not just non-Christians, but Christians who come up and go like, oh, wow. Like, I've realized for the first time this really stands up. Secondly, it shows that we're not afraid of questions. So when I can get to the end of a talk and I can just say, okay, any questions now, hands up. It shows something about the security and the confidence that I have in my faith in Christ, in the truth and the wonder of the gospel, to be able to do that. Most people are going to expect that I can stand up and give a talk for 20 minutes if I had enough preparation. What impresses people more is that I'm willing to then do another 20 minutes of taking questions. Because obviously I cannot prepare for the Q&A in the sense that I don't know what's going to come up. So that's a significant thing that we can show. It also ensures that, to use a kind of idiom, we scratch where people itch. In other words, when I'm giving a talk, I'm never quite sure whether that talk is addressing the issues that people care about, because it's not necessarily what they came for. But when I'm answering questions, I know that for at least one person in the room, this is going to be relevant. And normally, the person who asks the question from the floor is not just asking for themselves, but there'll be probably a number of other people who will be resonating with that question. And so often I say to people, thank you so much for your question. I reckon there's a load of other people who are probably asking the same thing, so they're probably quite thankful too. It also helps us to understand our audience and to gauge where our audience is at in terms of their understanding of what we've just said if we've given a talk. And so I really enjoy the Q&A session because the Q&A reveals how people are responding to what I've said. Sometimes the Q&A reveals that I've not done a very good job in my talk because they've all got this glaring question that I failed to address, that I needed to address within the actual presentation. And so I can get a sense in the Q&A of the kind of response. And that helps me when I come to do future talks because I get to know what kind of questions people ask. As we said the other day, good evangelistic preaching anticipates the objections and questions of our audience. And there's no better way to do that than actually hear the questions firsthand. So the more you work in a particular context with young people, with students, with older people, the more you'll get to learn what their questions are in the light of what you say. And then, as I said, it trains and encourages Christians. The best way to learn how to answer questions is often to see it being done. And I love watching Q&A sessions of other people. You can get them online, often on YouTube. You watch Ravi Zacharias, you watch Michael Ramsden, or you watch someone like that doing a public Q&A session, and you learn and you think, okay, I could do that. I couldn't do that because I couldn't tell that story, but I could learn from that. And so we get trained and encouraged as we watch it being done. And I want to say it's actually enjoyable. When you get a Q&A session that has a bit of comeback, where there's to and fro, where there's real interest, where there's movements, then that's a fun environment for people to be in. And people normally at the end think, I'm really glad I came, and I wish that could have gone on for longer. And by the way, the trick is always finish a Q&A session where people wish there was more time rather than less, which means that you don't always cover all the questions. And that's a deliberate thing because you want to then encourage conversation afterwards. We said you don't know the answer you don't know the background. We just talked about that. You can't answer questions back. If I'm talking to an individual and they ask me a question, the first thing I do is to ask them a question back because I want to have a conversation and I want to get to know what's behind the question. And I want to get to know a bit about their worldview. I would never just answer the question straight away in one-to-one conversation. In public Q&A, I can't do that because if I start having a conversation with you, the people at the back are like, well, this is no longer about me, and they leave. They will literally leave. So I need to be able to answer without being able to ask those kind of follow-up questions. And it's harder to come back to people when you don't know the answer. If I'm in Q&A with my friends and they ask me, what about this bit in Deuteronomy? And I can go like, I have no idea about that bit in Deuteronomy, but let me meet you next week and I'll tell you. There's no pressure in one-to-one conversations to have the answer. But as we said earlier, more pressure in a public setting because I'm not going to be able to meet with that whole audience again. And that's why we said sometimes a panel is helpful if you're starting in this because it takes a bit of the pressure off you having to know all of the answers. Okay? How do we take questions? A few things to say on this. It's worth saying, particularly if the Q&A is coming after a talk, that you give people plenty of time and notice that that's going to happen. If you just get to the end of your talk and you're like, okay, any questions? People are like, whoa, gosh, I need some time to process, to think. People don't immediately necessarily think of their questions. And so I want to make sure that people are thinking about that. So I always say at the beginning of my talk, I'm going to speak for 20 minutes. Then we're going to have time for questions. Please be thinking of your questions. Please be messaging your questions in now, and so on. Sometimes at the end of the talk, I give people a bit of a break. I have to make a decision. In some environments, if I give people a break, they all leave. So you have to just kind of keep on going whilst you've got people's attention. In other situations, it's kind of more chilled. You can say, okay, we're going to take 2 minutes now, turn to the person next to you, discuss what your question is, nominate someone to ask the question. That is a helpful way sometimes to generate questions if people haven't had a chance to think about them before. Now, I think the important thing is to have a combination of questions from the floor and questions that are asked privately through paper, through text, through an app, something like that. And there's several advantages to that. Number one, some people will not want to ask questions by putting their hand up. and you will encourage other people to therefore ask questions who are more timid. Other people, though, will feel that you are editing the questions if you don't allow people to put their hand up, because they feel that you've got too much control. And also, it feels a little bit sterile if you're saying to people like, you've got to do it all through the phones. It's quite nice to hear a voice from the audience asking a question. Sometimes it makes it much more fun, particularly if they're quite vociferous and antagonistic. It certainly gets everyone listening. And the third thing it does, though, and this is really important, is it gives you the opportunity to keep the Q&A moving. So if we have a Q&A, and I had this in Cambridge University a few years ago, done a talk on suffering, any questions, hands up. First question was a question about natural evil, about earthquakes, volcanoes, and so on. So I gave an answer to the question, but that's quite a difficult area to talk about in the question of suffering, and there were different views that even Christians would have on that. So then the next question was a question off the back of my answer to the first question, and then the third question was a question off the back of the answer to the second question, and then all of the questions focused on this really small little area of the much wider topic that we've been thinking about. So the beauty of having questions from the floor and questions that are asked privately is that you can keep it moving onto different topics. So what you do is you open it up to the floor, you might have a couple of questions, and then you say, okay, we're going to go to the phone, and we're going to have a couple of questions from the phone now. Back to the floor now. And that way, you just stop it from getting railroaded on one particular issue, which I found is really helpful. I find it helpful as the speaker to have a host or an MC who asks the questions if we have questions coming in on paper, on a text, or stuff like that, because that way it still feels like a Q&A. It seems a bit silly if I'm the one reading the question and then I'm the one answering the question. So have a bit of dynamism and back and forth on that. Oh, by the way, to say on this, I don't get paid by them, but Slido, sli.do, I think it's a Slovakian thing actually. I was in Slovakia and they told me about their friends who set this up. But I discovered it in Switzerland and we've used it a lot in England. It was a brilliant app for taking questions. And I now use this in any kind of forum that I'm doing questions in. Because what people can do is they either download the app on their phone or they just go onto the website, sli.do. You have an event code that's on the corner of the PowerPoint all the way through that can be like the name of the event or whatever. So it's easy. People go in, they put the event code in, and then they have on there the opportunity to ask questions. But they can also see all the other questions that people have currently asked. And they can vote up the questions they think are really interesting. So that way you get lots of audience participation. And at the end, you then know what the most popular questions are. So you're not dealing with the ones that only one person are asking. You're dealing with the ones that everyone wants answers. And it also is very transparent because it means that there's no way you can edit it. People can see the questions that are coming in on the app. So I really like using that. We still pause occasionally for people to ask questions from the floor or to come back from the floor. But using that app is really helpful. The free version gives you pretty much enough usability for the average event that you're doing. There are paid versions that cost a little bit and give you kind of a bit more kind of way of... Basically, you can keep questions from previous events so that you might want to go back to them and look at what people asked. But that's a really good app. I highly recommend that. There are a few others that do a similar thing. That's the best one I've seen. The other thing I'd say is keep to the allotted time. If you've got 20 minutes, make sure it stops at 20 minutes. And as we said, it's best to finish it when people want longer rather than when the last person is finally bored. Just one other thing on that I've learned, and this was from John Lennox. The last question, in one sense, is the most significant question because it's the one people will remember the most. Now, here's the danger, particularly if you're on Slido. On Slido, you'll start with the most popular question and you'll work your way down. So the last question will actually be the least popular or one of the less popular questions. And if you're doing it just kind of hands up from the floor, you have absolutely no control, do you? It's just like, the last question could be anything. And if you finish with a bad last question, it kind of means that the whole event finishes on a bit of a damp, well, we would say in English a damp squib. It means like, it doesn't finish well. So I did a talk on suffering, and it was like, oh, we just got time for one more question from over here. Yeah, what about the dinosaurs? Now, I don't mind talking about dinosaurs, but that's not the question I want to finish on. I want to finish by talking about Jesus, by talking about the gospel, by allowing people to focus on the heart of what I've just said. So what I do in the Q&A is I deliberately leave a question till the end. So if we're using Slido, I'm looking at the questions as they're coming up. And the hosts ask me a question and say, that's a great question. Actually, that's such a good question. Can we leave that one to the end to just give it a bit more time? No one worries about that because we're still answering the questions. But that way, deliberately, I'm making sure that we finish on the best one. And if we've had them texted in or people have written them down, I'm kind of just glancing through quickly beforehand and I say, make sure that one's the final question. Okay? So just having a bit of control helps the events in that way. Okay, how do we actually respond then? Those are all the kind of practicalities of how we might put an event together. When I was learning to play golf, I say learning, it gives the impression that I've learned. When I was trying to learn to play golf, my golf tutor told me that there's lots of things you have to think about when you hit the ball, right? You've got to think about your stance, you've got to think about where you're looking, you've got to think about how you're holding the club, you've got to think about how you bring it back, how you bring it through, where your feet, there's so many things to think about. But he says, if you're a bloke, you can only think about one thing at once, right? Women obviously should be better at golf, shouldn't they? But if you're a bloke, you've got to think about all of these things, but you can't. So he said, this is how you learn to play golf. He says, what you do is you focus on one thing and you do it over and over and over again until it becomes natural. And eventually, when it's kind of in your deep conscious, you don't actually have to think about it, you just do it naturally. And then he says, you focus on a different aspect and you do that over and over and over again until it becomes part of your unconscious reactions. And then he says, after about 50 years, you get kind of reasonable at golf. So that's why I gave up. But what I'm going to give you, these are my swing thoughts, okay? These are kind of things that I'm thinking about when I'm answering questions. Now, you can't think about all of them at once, but over time, these are things that you want to develop in a Q&A session. The first is this: be calm and gracious. It shows that you're secure. Your posture, your manner is really key in this. If I'm kind of looking kind of nervous and anxious with my arms crossed and everything else, that gives the impression that I'm worried about what's going to come up. Whereas if I'm smiling, if I thank people for their questions, if I'm appreciative, that helps people to see something about my security and my confidence in Christ. So our manner, our posture is really key. Secondly, to be appreciative of good questions is also important. Now, if you say this after every question, then it becomes a bit like a monotony. Thanks for the good question, thanks for the good question, thanks for the good question. And some questions are better than others. But sometimes, you get a question that's really good, and I can say, oh, thanks, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked that, because I reckon some other people were probably thinking the same thing. Or, oh, thanks, that's quite a personal question. I really respect the fact that you were willing to ask that. Or, hey, thanks, that's a really interesting point. And I'm glad you asked that because I didn't have time to cover that in the talk, but I'd like to look at it now. What you're doing is you're appreciating people and valuing them rather than demeaning them. You are also indicating to other people in the audience that, it's okay to ask questions. They're not going to be, talked down at. They're not going to be it's not going to be confrontational. You're also, ironically, giving yourself about 20 seconds to think of the answer whilst you say something of appreciative kind of response. So rather than having to dive straight in, I'm saying that and my brain is thinking, oh, help, what do I say? So that's a second thing. Thirdly, be understanding. Feel the weight of the question. I kind of mentioned this the other day in identification. We want to really appreciate why people have the questions or the objections they do. And to do that, my friend said, he says, you often dig the hole deeper before you try to get out of it. To give you an example, someone asked the question, what about people that have never heard about Jesus? What happens to them? Now, rather than just answering that question straight away, I might say, you know what, thanks for that question, because that's a really important issue, isn't it? We've thought today about the exclusive claims of Jesus, but there are clearly people in the world today who haven't had the opportunity of hearing what we've heard. What do we say about them? Is God going to say to them, oh, unlucky, you just lived in the wrong place? But it also raises other questions, doesn't it? Like, what about people who lived before Jesus? What happens to them? Is God going to say to them, unlucky, you just lived at the wrong time? And you might also think, well, what about people who have serious mental disabilities that mean they aren't able to process the kind of things we've heard today? What about them? Isn't it unfair that God would exclude them because they can't do something that they're being called to do? So I really appreciate a question because it gets at the heart of the question of the justice of God. And then I want to start trying to answer the question. But you see what I've done? I've actually made the question 3 times harder before I tried to make it easier for myself. People appreciate that because you're not just trying to give people a kind of straw man kind of response. You're really trying to feel the weight of that question. Number 4, Be humorous. Now, you can't always use humor. In some questions, it would be wrong to use humor in when someone's just expressed, that their mother's just died or something like that. So that's not the time to obviously crack jokes. But there is a danger sometimes in Q&As. They can get quite intense. And just being able to say something a bit more light, a little bit more funny, can just set people at ease. So just be thinking about that. It's not normally pre-planned, but if you can just help people in that way and take away some of the intensity, it's not because you're not wanting to be serious. But if you're intense and serious all the time, people can't cope with that. So you need to have kind of light moments of relief where people literally can just breathe a little bit before you go back into a serious thing. It's the same in an evangelistic talk. If you're intensely serious all the way through, people actually phase out. That's where humor comes in. Gives people a breathing chance, and actually the best time to make a serious point is just after humor normally. And that's the way it can work. Next one, be wise. Anticipate people's reactions. There are things that you could say in answer to questions that are correct but wouldn't necessarily be helpful. So for instance, someone puts their hand up and they say, are all other religions going to hell? And you say, yeah. Next question. That's not going to be very helpful, is it? Because what are people now thinking? They're thinking, you arrogant, bigoted so-and-so. How dare you say that in a pluralistic kind of culture that we live in today? So what have I done? I've answered the question correctly, but I actually haven't answered it correctly because they've now assumed a whole load of things about me that hopefully aren't true, and a load of things about the gospel that aren't true. So I need to be thinking, how are people going to react to what I'm about to say? Because if I don't anticipate that reaction, then I'm actually going to, and you can physically see it. You can see people kind of getting kind of annoyed, and so I try and anticipate that. And so sometimes I might start, if that was the question, and say, it'd be really arrogant of me, wouldn't it, to say that basically the only people who are going to heaven are the people who tick Christian on the census. I mean, how arrogant? Why would God exclude people from heaven just because they tick the wrong box, just because they were born in the wrong culture, just because they believed the wrong thing? So again, I've made it more hard. I've tried to resonate with their reaction. But then I kind of want to answer it. And I might say something like, but you know what, actually? The Bible says it's not our religion that keeps us from God. It's something else. The Bible calls it sin. It's the stuff in our life that's wrong. That's the stuff that separates us from God. And hey, if religion alone was enough to overcome that barrier between me and God, then fine. But actually, the problem is my moral efforts alone are never going to be enough to overcome the barrier the Bible talks about in my life. And that's why the Bible talks about Jesus doing what we can't do. And that's so wonderful because it means that I don't have to earn God's forgiveness. He's given it to me in Jesus. And that's open to everyone who's willing to receive it. But the important thing is, are we willing to receive it? Or are we going to try and say, I'm actually fine on my own? Because you know what? No one's going to be in heaven saying, I deserve to be here. That's why heaven's going to be great, because there'll be no arrogance or pride in heaven. We'll all be there because of a gift of grace. So I'm kind of trying to turn it around, anticipate the reaction, but still answer the question in that setting. Next one, be focused on Jesus. I'm always thinking, how can I bring it back to the gospel? How can I get to Christ? And so whether the question's about the evidence for God, I could obviously talk about lots of reasons, can't I? The cosmological argument, the moral arguments, and so on for the existence of God. Of course, ultimately, I can talk about, Jesus, who is the one who reveals God to us. Or again, if being asked about other religions, I could say lots of things about different religions and what they say and what they don't say and so on, but ultimately I want to talk about the uniqueness of Christ. I sometimes say this, of course there are things in other religions that I agree with. I'm not saying that all religions are wrong and everything they say. No, that's ridiculous. But hey, can I tell you there are 3 things that I found in the Christian faith that I haven't found anywhere else. I found, number 1, a God who's revealed himself in person, not just by sending a prophet or a teacher, but in person as a human being, Jesus Christ. Secondly, I found a God who hasn't just given me moral codes to live by, but a God who lived the life I should have lived, died the death I should have died, and offers me free forgiveness. And thirdly, I found a God who is willing to come into my life and change me from the inside out by his Spirit within me. And those are 3 things I've never found in any religion, and they are found in Jesus, and that's what I commend to you. So you see what you're trying to do? You're trying to bring it back all the time to the person of Christ. Next, be positive. The gospel is good. Lots of questions that you get kind of assume that it's not. So how can I turn it around positively? Hopefully you've seen in those examples how I'm already trying to do that. Someone might say, yeah, but what about God? He sends people to hell. I want to answer the question, but ultimately I want to get to the point where I say, you know what? The beautiful message of the Bible is that two things. One, justice is going to be done. It's actually a good thing that God's going to sort out the mess of this world. But secondly, that's a big worry for us, isn't it? Because what about the stuff that's wrong in my life? Hey, but thirdly, isn't it wonderful there's a God who is willing to take responsibility for that stuff so that I don't have to? And he did that through Jesus. So I don't have to go to hell. In fact, you don't. Nobody does. And God doesn't make us earn it. He offers it to us as a gift. So I'm always turning around positively. How can Christianity be so exclusive? Hey, you know what? This isn't exclusive. In a sense, it's wonderfully inclusive. The Bible says this is for every tribe, nation, and tongue. This isn't just for religious people. This is for everyone. Hey, the guys in the Bible who most loved Jesus? They weren't the religious people. It was the people that the religious people hated that loved Jesus the most. So I'm just trying to kind of always think, turn it around positively, show that the gospel is good news. Next, be prepared. If you're giving a talk on a particular topic, you might want to try and anticipate the kind of questions that will come up off the back of it. Sometimes I deliberately leave certain questions unanswered in the talk because I know that they'll come up in the Q&A. And so if I'm giving a talk on suffering, I may not talk lots about the problem of natural evil, but I need to be ready to answer that question in the Q&A. If I was giving a talk on religious violence in contemporary culture, I've got to be ready for questions about religious violence in the Old Testament because they're probably almost definitely going to come up. So whatever I'm talking on, try and think through what are the questions that are likely to come up. Now the beauty is, if you speak regularly, in particular if you use something like the Slido app, you can keep a record of the questions that get asked. And so you can come back to them and say, okay, what were the questions? What do I need to learn on? How can I get better? So be preparing yourself as much as possible beforehand. Nearly there. Be honest. If you don't know the answer, don't pretend that you're the world expert on it. But do try and help people to know where they could go on it. So I might say something like, there's probably more that I could say on this subject, and there'll be others that will be more equipped to be able to deal with that subject. There's some books at the back that you might want to look at and so on. If you're unsatisfied in what I said, please come back to me at the end. I'd happily talk about this further or come back to you if you want to know more or whatever. So there are ways that people can continue to engage, even if you haven't given the full answer. And then be helpful. As I said, suggest ways that people can continue to look into this. Your answer to people's questions will always be, in a sense, too short. 2 minutes is not enough to give a full answer to any particular issue. So it's helpful to say, hey, this is just a few pointers. Here's where you could look at this more. Or if you're doing like a mission week, you could say, hey, that's such a good question. You know what? Friday night, we're going to look at that question. Come back. So those are good times to advertise future events. And then lastly, be prayerful. I'm not talking about having a prayer meeting in the middle of the Q&A. All I'm saying is when people are raising questions, as the question is being read out to me, I'm normally praying and just saying, Lord, please give me wisdom. Help me to understand where this question is coming from and help me to think about how I could respond to it appropriately. So those are a load of tips. Now, as I said, they're like the swing thoughts, okay? You're not going to be able to think about all of those things in a Q&A, but you might find that over time, as you're doing this, there are some things you could work on. So a few years ago, when I was just starting out, I was doing a Q&A, and my friend and mentor, in fact, the same guy that had done that Q&A back at school when I was 14, he came to listen to the talk. And he said, you know what, your answers were really good, they were really clear, just try and work on being more positive. Try and finish with something positive each time you answer a question. That was really helpful advice, and for the next few months, I tried to work on that until it became natural, and so on. So those are kind of general tips that we could look at. Now, before we go to questions from you, because it would be inappropriate to have a session on Q&A without a Q&A. What if things go wrong? There are a whole load of things that can go wrong in a Q&A, and the good news is that they don't normally all go wrong at the same time. But there's always a chance that one of these things will happen. What if no one asks a question? What if people don't ask questions, they just want to preach mini-sermons at you or give statements? I once had a Muslim imam come to a public Q&A, and he spent as long trying to make his question, which was actually a sermon, in the Q&A as I'd just given the talk for. What if there are too many questions, but all from one person? They're dominating the Q&A. What if people get angry and it all gets quite emotional? What if the questions go off topic? What if questions are obviously Christian questions. Can you tell me what your view on Calvinism is? Please tell me your view on the second coming. Don't mind talking about it. May not be so helpful in that context. What if other people tried to answer the question on your behalf? I had that once. Someone put their hand up and said, it's not a question, but I want to answer the question of that Muslim over there. I'm like, it's going to get crazy. What if the questions get stuck on one particular issue? And what if you don't actually understand the question in the first place? All of those things can happen, but don't worry, they don't all happen at once. But normally in any Q&A, at least one of those things will happen. Okay, what might you do? Let's go through them. What if there's no questions? Well, sometimes people don't have questions immediately, and that's why, as we said at the beginning, you need to give people time. So if there are no questions, you can give people a couple of minutes to discuss. You can sometimes get a Christian to give a primer question. Sometimes I can think of a few fillers that I can say to give people a few moments, like, it's always hard to ask the first question, isn't it, guys? Hey, let's skip the first question. Let's go straight to the second question. Who would like to ask the second question? That makes everyone laugh. It gives you another 30 seconds. Normally I find, even if questions are slow coming at the start, once you've had one genuine question, the rest will flow and you'll never have a problem. So always worth just giving people a bit of time at that beginning part. Secondly, what if they are statements but not questions? Well, I just like to ask people at the end, can you tell me what your question is? Because you can't answer a statement. And if people make statements, then you give a statement to a statement. It's not very dynamic. It just becomes kind of us talking at each other rather than to each other. So ask people what their question is. If they're going on, like my Muslim imam friend in Montenegro was, there comes a point after about a minute where you're actually okay to interrupt and just say, sorry, can I interrupt you and just ask you, what is your question? You might feel you're being rude, if you're British anyway, by doing that, but everyone else in the audience is thankful you've done it, because otherwise you'll lose the rest of the people. You're not just about trying to care for that person, you're caring for the audience in managing the Q&A. What if one person dominates the Q&A and they're asking all the questions? Well, that's the advantage of having a mixture of questions from the app and questions from the floor, because you can say, okay, we're going to take a question now from the app. So you keep it moving. If someone keeps coming back on your questions, you might need to say to them, not straight away, but after 2 or 3 times they've asked a question, to say, I appreciate you've got questions. I'd be happy to answer more of them at the end, but I'd love to give some other people an opportunity so we can be fair to them. Is that okay? So you're not suppressing them, but you're also stopping them from railroading the whole Q&A. If they still come back and say, yeah, but I want to ask this question, you know what you do? You just don't answer it. You say, I appreciate your question, but actually I do want to give other people a chance. I'll chat to you about that at the end. And that way, you can move the whole thing on. Because if you answer it at that point, they'll just have another one and so on. What if people get angry? Sometimes it's quite emotional. I think what you're trying to do is just absorb something of that anger. Normally anger comes from pain. Try and see the heart pain that's behind it. Be appreciative, be warm, smile, and be gracious in that way. And pray that the Lord gives you a spirit of empathy that can absorb something of that. And sometimes you can just say something that cuts through that anger to the pain beneath. And I've seen people go from seething with anger to tears just because you're able to say something that gets beneath the surface. What if questions go off topic? It depends how many questions there are. If people are not asking many questions, I just like, it's great, we've got a question, let's go with it. If, though, you've got loads of questions, then sometimes it's legitimate to say, let's stick to the ones that are most on topic, or, you know what, there's going to be a talk on that on such and such a day, or, you know what, there's a book at the back that's got a chapter on that, because you want to try, if you've just given a talk on a topic, to keep the questions generally around that issue for the benefit of the rest of the audience. If they're obviously from Christians, it's kind of hard because you've got to say something, but I don't want to say too much. So sometimes I would say, thanks for your question. There may be a number of people here who don't even understand where that question is coming from because it's a bit more of a specialist question on a particular issue. I'd be happy to chat about that later. I might say something on it, but I'm just not wanting to get drawn into big secondary theological debates in that moment in time. And it's worth being aware of open issues on this. So if someone asks a question about Calvinism or Arminianism or about the exact nature of hell or about baptism or that kind of stuff, I just normally say from the front, you know what? There are people who love Jesus and believe the Bible who have different views on this, And that's okay. And if you become a Christian, you'll suddenly realize at some points that Christians don't agree on everything. That's fine, because there are things that we really do agree on that are central in the foundation of our faith. This isn't one of those central issues, and so it's okay to have legitimate different views on it. So you're just being kind of honest about it in that setting. If the questions, if other people try and answer, you've just got to be quite strong here, because if you don't control it, what you'll end up is a free-for-all, and everyone will be talking to everyone. So I would just say, I'm so pleased that you've got something to say to that gentleman over there, but hey, can I suggest, why don't you get a coffee and talk together at the end? But for now, for the sake of everyone else, let's keep the questions directed to the front. Easy, you move on. Questions get stuck on one issue. As we said, that's why it's useful to have the app so that you can keep it moving. And so if all the questions from the floor, that's a bit more of a danger. If you don't understand the question, it is impossible to answer the question. So sometimes you don't understand the question because the person is actually just trying to be really clever. And the reality is no one else in the audience understands the question either. John Lennox was at an event a while back, and he was giving this talk. This guy stands up, asks this really, really complex question with a whole load of words that even John didn't understand. And John stood there and he said, I haven't a clue what you've just said. And then he said, does anyone else here have a clue what you've just said? And everyone shook their heads. And he said, okay, let's move on to the next question. And basically it was fine. Now, obviously the danger is if everyone else says yes, then you're in trouble. So you've got to be wise if you use that one. Sometimes if I don't understand the question, I try and repeat the question back, which is helpful, sometimes anyway. Gives you a bit of time to think if you just articulate the question in your own words, especially if the question's been long, from a voice at the back that not everyone has heard. You can just say, okay, I think what you're saying is this. Is that correct? And that way you've got agreements. If the question is on the app or a text, obviously you don't know who's asked it. So what I would do in that position, I'd say, I'm not totally sure what this question is getting at. What I assume it's saying is this, and then I will rephrase the question in my own words, and then I'll answer the question that I've just rephrased. And I might say, if I've missed the point, please come back to me on it, okay? So just try and make sure there's clarity before you answer the question. I've looked back and I've realized the times I most struggled to answer questions was really because I didn't know what I was trying to answer in the first place. Of course, it's never going to work.